Dr. Francisco Gil-White, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Rabbi.
I have a clip over here with Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson. I want to play this clip. We'll watch it together and then we'll talk about it.
Do you think there's any difference, or do you both think there's any difference? Ben's belief Ben's Jewish and your belief is Christian, comes from the Christian tradition.
Yeah.
Does that matter at all? Whatever differences there are in that little place where you're both saying, we see the reasons why our morals and ethics and all that come from this. We're also acknowledging, the real world and biology and all of those things. Whatever differences you may have, which I don't even know that any of the three of us know what those differences are, do they even matter?
They might. That would be a lovely
I'd love to figure out if there are.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. For me, it depends on the brand of religion that a person is espousing. So,
yeah. So let's just do this with
sure.
you two.
So my feeling. I'm writing a book on this right now, actually. There are certain principles that obviously undergird Christianity that are from the Judaic tradition. I mean, that clearly the first
it's like a manifestation of the prophetic tradition.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's essentially an attempt to merge Jerusalem with Athens is I think the book of John is the most obvious example, using the logos as sort of the unifying feature, and writing the whole thing in Greek, right? I mean, that was not the lingua franca of the time. That was not what people were speaking, except in educated circles. So all the Judaic principles, things like a God involved in history, a God who cares about individuals, the notion that you have a choice between good and evil, so choose good, and so that you will live long on the earth, right? All these things were taken forward into Christianity. I think that overall the conflict between Christianity and Judaism, in large measure, is, especially in the early conflict, was political rather than ideological in a lot of ways. It was a new religion attempting to establish its own footing, and was angry that Jews would not join this new religion and leave behind tradition. I think that there are certain ways in which Christianity, like for example, the main distinction between Christianity and Judaism that people usually make is that Christianity is a grace-based religion and Judaism is an acts-based religion, meaning that Judaism says you sort of earn your way into heaven, right? You earn your way toward a better life. And Christianity says if you believe, right, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. If you believe, then you're good. But the truth is that Christianity sort of backdoors the Judaic view by saying, if you really do believe, then you're going to act in these particular ways that demonstrate your belief.
Yeah, well,
right?
there's this weird paradoxical relationship between the idea of belief in Christianity, the belief that Christ came to save everyone from their sins, and that all you have to do is admit that and you're redeemed. Like, there's symbolic truth to that would take a long time to unpack. But there's also an injunction that goes along with that to imitate Christ in your life.
Exactly.
Right? So it's like,
I feel like a lot of these distinctions are almost, some of them are almost a little false. I mean, meaning that they're either Christian misreads of Judaism or Jewish misreads of Christianity. And that when you get to the root of it, I mean, this is what Maimonides says, that there are significant differences between Judaism and Christianity, but his view of Christianity from a Jewish historical point of view is that Judaism was never bound to convert billions of people around the world, but Christianity was, specifically because we have a lot of crap we got to do. I mean, Jews have we have 613 commandments. Yeah. We have to keep kosher. We have to do all of these things.
I appreciate you doing a lot of them for me.
Yeah, no problem. I'm taking care of it. Yeah, I'll transfer over the points in the afterlife.
I assume someone's.
I'll give you one of my afterlives. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I think that Christianity ends up doing a lot of those same things that, there were supposed to be stark distinctions, just under a different guise. So when it comes to this is why, in the modern world, when the discrimination between, from Christians toward Jews largely has ended, I think that what you're seeing is this tremendous confluence between particularly Orthodox Jews and observant Christians on matters of values. Because once Christianity, in the late 20th century, in the mid 20th century, in America more broadly with Christianity, because American Christianity is very different than European Christianity. Once there was an idea that Jews were not the enemy to be converted, but maybe you still want to convert me, but we're not going to come at you with a knife, we're going to come at you with a book. Yeah. And that we share a common framework for how the world is supposed to work. You just may not agree with the second half of the book, right? And then I think that's created a pretty good working relationship with. This is why I'm struggling to come up with what are the significant differences. And so I need a Christian to tell me what is the significant difference. I can argue with it.
My question,
because I know my own religion better than I know Christianity.
My question has been, I don't know if the role that the state plays in Judaism and Christianity is the same, because I'm not sure what to make of what I would say is the Jews put a tremendous amount of emphasis on the state as a mechanism for salvation, something like that. That might be the symbolic idea that underlies the establishment of Israel. And I would say that in Christianity...
Do you mean the nation, or you mean like the government?
I mean the nation, but then it gets tangled up with the government, right? So
right. This is a distinction that Christianity is a universalistic religion, right?
Yeah.
The idea is that in the kingdom of God, everyone is Christian, basically, and Judaism is not in one sense, but it is in another, which is that God identifies a nation that He treasures as His own, and He has a special relationship with that nation. But Judaism is not exclusivist with regard to who gets into heaven. So there's this basic idea in Genesis that there are commandments that are given prior to the giving of the Torah, right? That there's what we call the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 commandments that are given to the sons of Noah, meaning all mankind. And these are things like no murder, no idolatry, no adultery. They basically mirror a lot of the 10 commandments. And so the idea in Judaism is that God, it's almost like a priestly caste. God chose this specific group of people to be a light unto the nations by demonstrating what a godly lifestyle looks like if you dedicate every aspect of your life to God. And then He said to everybody else, I know not everybody else is up to this, and in fact, Judaizers are supposed to try and turn away converts. But you can still get into heaven. The idea that we are trying to force anyone into being Jewish, that's not a thing. So nationalism without the conversion.
You can think about that psychologically as an attempt to both manage the preservation of group identity. So that would be culture, a cultural identity, which has some utility, and also to be able to coexist with others who are doing things in a different way.
And again, Judaism has had a long history of, just like every other religion, of sort of evolution on this stuff. Right? Like when you read the book of Joshua, there's actual forced conversion that happens in the book of Joshua. But by the time you get to early Christianity and midpoint Judaism, right, because Judaism is a lot older than Christianity, then you're already talking about Jews who are not looking to convert people. They sort of want to live in their own state. They don't want to bother anyone else for the most part. So the idea of like a tidal wave of conquering Jews going out, I mean, even to think about it now is hilarious, right? Nobody thinks about it that way, except if you're a conspiratorial nutbag. But it's
the Inquisitions usually work the other way.
That's right.
So would anything that you might have heard Ben just say, would anything jive with a fundamental belief that you have that would cause a problem? You know what I mean? Like cause a problem in society.
Well, I think that one potential problem that's worth discussing, but it would take forever to discuss it, is the relative role of the individual versus the state. I mean, you see this argued out in the prophetic books in the Old Testament.
Yes.
I mean, there's the Jewish state, and it's sort of the central player in some sense, but there's clear evidence that it can become corrupt, it can fall away, and that a prophet who's an individual has to step forward and revivify it, right? And so there's tremendous emphasis on the utility of the individual. And you see that in Judaism, I would say, overall, it's a very cohesive, it promotes in-group cohesion, let's say, but it also allows for individual expression in a very interesting ways, because there's tremendous emphasis in Jewish culture on learning and articulation and mastery of ideas, and so that provides this space for the individual to flourish. With Christianity, you see more of a move away, I would say, from the idea of the state. Now, that's not necessarily without its troubles. One of the things Jung pointed out was, well, as Christianity becomes more about the individual, the religion itself tends to fragment like it did with Protestantism until it just fragments right to the point where every individual is their own church. And then you have no continuity and no tradition. And the Catholics were kind of a bulwark against that. But I do think that there's a discussion to be had about the relative role of the individual in redeeming the world, let's say, versus the state in redeeming the world. And I would say the Christians come down more strongly on the side of the individual, and the Jews come down more strongly on the side of the state. Now, like, I'm willing to be corrected about that, because I've never actually been able to have a discussion with anyone about that.
I would like to correct Jordan Peterson on this.
Me too, but you go first.
Since he wants to be corrected, I will do it.
Okay.
It's interesting that he makes such a strong argument about Jews being obsessed with the state, whereas Christians are not, when it was in fact Christians ruling Jews and not the other way around for centuries on end. And it was Christian government that made it impossible for individuals to flourish, not Jewish government. So it's interesting that his entire thesis depends on paying attention to the Book of Kings and the Book of Chronicles and the books of the prophets to make the case that Judaism is obsessed with the state because the prophets are criticizing the kings. Okay, fair enough. But notice that this is always a defense, in a sense, of the individual, because the prophets are upbraiding the Israelite kings for oppressing Jewish individuals, for two things: for oppressing Jewish individuals and for abandoning the law, for becoming polytheists, for going back into paganism. Those are the two main objections.
Idol worship, yeah.
Right, exactly. Those are the two main objections of the prophets: is you're not moral, you are hurting people, you are not defending ethics, which is usually translated as righteousness in Shakespearean English. But it's really, they're talking about ethics. And the other thing they're complaining about is the first commandment. They're going back to different forms of idol worship, paganism. So I don't think Jordan Peterson has this right. I mean, I think there is no better protection of the individual from the state than you see in Judaism. The preoccupation with the state in Judaism is precisely so that the individual will be protected. That's why Judaism innovates with the idea of separation of powers, of limiting the power of the king with law, and so on and so forth. It took the Christians a long time to arrive at the same ideas through the European Enlightenment, and there is every reason to believe that those ideas were not untethered, but were in fact inspired by the reading of the book of Exodus and what Christians call the Old Testament.
You identify as a Noahide, and I've seen your recent video where you talk and explain what this means. And I don't think that you came to be a Noahide because you studied the 7 laws and said, this is what I want to do. Perhaps, and correct me if I'm wrong, you saw the big picture of the history and of God, and you said, I want to be in a relationship with God. And then you said, the rabbi said, well, there are 7 mitzvahs, the 7 things that you can do. So it wasn't really that you looked at these 7 things, but it was actually that, and that's like a movement that's happening right now, that people 150 years ago, people wouldn't openly, you would have to be nuts to associate or identify with the Jewish faith because we've been persecuted for so long. So I think that although
that danger still exists.
And yes, it does, especially that you're in Ashkelon and you're literally putting your life on the front over here. So I think and secondly, I would add that one of the important things about morality as a understood idea, meaning we understand we shouldn't torture animals, we understand that we should be faithful, we understand we shouldn't we should have courts of systems of laws. But when God asks us to do things as far as morality, we really, at a certain point, want to do the things not because we so much understand them, but because they're God's will, meaning that there is a separation in the Torah where obviously there's reasons why we do things, but there's also because God commanded us to do it. And that's ultimately the way people, very different than me, where I was first introduced to the commandments before I was introduced to God. And
okay,
I think
just to answer your question there, my process was as follows. I convinced myself first that something very important historically was going on with the impact of the Torah in human history. So first I came to that realization. Oh my God, this on purely historical evidence, it is obvious that this is the most important book ever to appear in the history of the human species. That was my first realization, because the impact of the Torah, the impact of the Jewish movement on world history is nothing short of astonishing. And then I started noticing something that was an even bigger impact on my psychology, which was when I started studying very carefully the history of the Torah and the history of the Jewish people. the performance of the Jewish people, and therefore of the Torah, because the Torah produces the Jewish people, seemed more and more implausible to me. In other words, given that the Torah is a system of law, of politics, of social relations, of ethics, etc., that grows out of a slave revolt, as narrated in the book of Exodus, right? Given that origin, naturally, the system, the Jewish system, is designed to free humanity from oppression, as you would expect, for the law of the escaped slaves, which is what the law of Moses is. It's the law of the escaped slaves. So that kind of body of law, that kind of political orientation is a danger to repressive ruling elites that want to enslave everybody. And therefore, the very content of Jewish law attracts the attacks of the totalitarian fascists in every single historical period. So the Jews have always been the object of genocidal attacks. So you might have expected, I mean, it was reasonable to expect that the Jewish people would be the most unstable social system in history. Despite the genocidal attacks, all of the cultures that were contemporaneous with the Jews, let's say 2,500 years ago, when the exiles returned to Jerusalem and began their and the Jews began their great impact on world history, all of those cultures now don't exist, and the Jews are still with us. So the social system that should have been the most unstable turns out to be the most stable. That looks like a miracle. It began to make me suspicious that there might be some kind of divine involvement in the design of the Torah, and that became my path to accepting the Torah as divinely inspired and the Jews as the special people of God, as the Torah claims they are. And once I took that step, I later learned that when someone does this without converting to Judaism, which is my case, and when you are accepting the basic principles of ethics that are taught by the Torah, then you're a Noahide, and that's what it means to follow the seven laws. The seven laws are the basic principles of ethics, which I agree with, I accept, just as I accept that the Torah is divinely inspired and that the Jews are the special holy people of God. So all of those things together make me a Noahide, basically, by definition. And the only thing missing was my formal profession of Noahide faith, which I did last week in the court of Rabbi
Mazel tov, mazel tov.
Thank you. So now I'm done. Now I'm not only ideologically but also formally a Noahide.
Well, welcome. This is quite amazing, listeners. If you're watching, for somebody from you're living in Mexico and you pick up and you say, I want to come to Israel and I want to, and this is something which hasn't happened. Like we said before, it hasn't happened. There are not, in the past 150 years, people have not done this. And this is part of, the prophecy that was given, that the Gentile will come to the Jew and say, Nelcha imachem, let me go with you, ki shamanu Elokim imachem, because I have heard that God is with you. So how would you describe what's going on today as a result of these 2,000 years between the Christians and the Jews? Islam is,
Well, there's a lot of haters in Christianity. We shouldn't minimize that problem. But of course, there are also many, many Christians who are allies of the Jewish people, and thank God for them. Especially the Christian Zionists, who are such strong supporters of the state of Israel. But we must not sweep under the rug that there are quite a lot of Christian anti-Semites, and that's a problem we need to fix. We need to solve the problem of anti-Semitism. It's difficult because there are forces in this world, they have always existed, that have a lot of power and that wish to enslave everybody. So the way I explain it, I have a broad model of the history of Western Asia, which includes Europe and its descendant societies, right? It's an entire system from, let's say, Persia all the way to the West, and then the descendant societies. In that entire geography, for 4,300 years, there has been a contest between what I call Semitism and anti-Semitism, and they've been butting heads ever since. And what I call Semitism is the ethical tradition of Babylonia, of what began as Sumeria and then became the Akkadian Empire. When Sargon of Akkad launched his revolution in Sumer, he began a tradition of making the civilizational goal the search for an ethical life of universal brotherhood and justice and compassion. That begins in that particular place, and it becomes a very stable cultural system and political system where every king, once they acceded to power, because they were trying to imitate Sargon, who had a kind of eternal prestige in that system, which lasted for 2,000 years. Every new king, imitating Sargon, felt the cultural obligation to promulgate new legal reforms to protect ordinary people better. Okay, so that kind of civilization was the incubator of its most sophisticated, most exquisite product, which is the Jewish people, which is the Torah and Tanakh and all of the ensuing flourishing of legal, political, and ethical rabbinical thought, right? That all emerges out of Mesopotamian Semitism. And what has been battling Semitism on the other side is anti-Semitism. Now, I call Semitism what came out of Mesopotamia because that civilizational search for an ethical life was invented by Semitic peoples. The Akkadians were Semites. It was continued by Amorites and Chaldeans and Arameans and Hebrews in its most sophisticated development. But it was Mesopotamian civilization with its ethical longing, with its longing for the ethical life. That's a product of the Semitic peoples. So it makes sense to call it Semitism. And the effort to destroy all that, to enslave everybody and impose on us a totalitarian world of oppression, that's what I'm calling anti-Semitism. And when you look at the last 4,300 years of history, it becomes rather economical to fit the most important political developments into this framework of Semitism versus anti-Semitism. Everything becomes very clear. The entire.
So if I understand you correctly, I understand Semitism would be I guess not forcing everybody into one box, and anti-Semitism would be forcing everybody into one box, making everybody follow your dictator rule. I mean, and Iran and Israel, for instance, are two very strange countries because
I just want to make one clarification about that. I think that's just one aspect of it,
right,
Aron. I think yes, Semitism is more tolerant of people's differences, absolutely, because it is trying to live an ethical life, and imposing yourself on others is unethical. So I would say yes, but it's much more than that. It's the whole concert of ideas about how to be ethical. That's what I'm calling Semitism, because that search was inaugurated by the Semitic peoples of southern Mesopotamia 4,300 years ago.
But the heart of the conversation that Ben was having with Jordan was really about if the Jews and the Christians, when they first started out, there was a political problem because the Christians were saying, we're the continuation of the Jews. The Messiah has come. The Jews say, what we need to do is we need to follow the word of the Torah, the 613 commandments, and by following these commandments, we will be essentially saved through the performance of these mitzvos. And
once you understand the political impact of Judaism, it becomes obvious that the natural bias is attraction to Judaism for people who are at the bottom. The natural bias is, oh, Judaism is great for me. It's on my side. God is a friend of the poor, a friend of the slave, a friend of those who suffer injustice. Fantastic. That's me. If you're at the bottom, you look at Judaism, and the natural response is, I want more of that. In order to produce anti-Semitism, therefore, gigantic investments are necessary by the oppressive power elites to poison the minds of the multitudes and make them see the Jews as monsters instead of liberators. Okay, so anti-Semitism actually requires tremendous investments, top-down investments, because otherwise what you get is what you were seeing in the first 2 centuries before Jesus, and even in the first 2 centuries after Jesus, which is that Judaism was tremendously popular with the lower classes.
Is there really something going on between the Orthodox Jews and the religious Christians right now on things of values?
Meaning?
Well, right now, the war that's going on in Israel is a question in the world of morals. The whole world has come on two sides of the fence that Israel is being immoral, which is very interesting that has moved that way. But I think the point that Ben is making over here is that there's a lot of similarities between the Christian Judeo morality and the religious Jews and the religious Christians are very close together.
I see. Well, I think at least in the formal register, in other words, in the official pronouncements of Christian communities and Christian authorities, ethics is basically Jewish. So Christian authorities and Christian communities have always said, you must not commit homicide, you must not steal, you must love your brother as you love yourself, you must be kind to strangers, to the sick, you must be kind to the poor, turn the other cheek, all this stuff. That all comes out of Judaism. All of that trying to be good, to be a good ally to your fellow human beings, right? All of that comes out of Judaism. There's nothing new in Christianity on this level. And then, so in that sense, Christian communities and Jewish communities have always had that intersection. In addition, in the modern world, which is what I think Ben was referring to, you have a strong emphasis in Christians who become very orthodox or very religious, if you want to call it like that. There's a strong emphasis on, for example, the family, a strong emphasis on sexual morality, a strong emphasis on reading the Bible, especially in the in some of the evangelical Christian communities and all these newer Christian communities that don't really like to be labeled evangelical, but share a lot in common with evangelical churches, and which are strongly Judaizing Christian churches, right? In all of those, you see a very strong emphasis on reading the Bible, on knowing it well, which is also something they have in common with Orthodox Jews. So I would agree with Ben that in the modern world, Jews who take religion very seriously and Christians who take religion very seriously have quite a lot in common. And in fact, in some of these Christian movements, you see a very strong Judaizing trend, because these are Christians who are very, let us say, excited by the opportunity to get closer to Jesus via understanding better the Jewish context of Jesus, because they are hyper aware of the fact that Jesus was a Jew, that he was preaching in a Jewish context to other Jews, and that his entire education and worldview were Jewish, right? So these Christian movements take that very, very seriously. And in order to get closer to Jesus and to understand him better, they actually do a lot of careful reading of what they call the Old Testament of Tanakh, and they not only read it carefully, but consider it relevant to their own theological development and their moral reasoning and their legal reasoning and so forth, instead of treating it as some kind of fossil that is no longer relevant to the life of a Christian.
Okay, fair enough. I still have a lot to say on this, but I want to finish this clip, and then we'll get into the meat and potatoes.
Because once Christianity in the late 20th century, in the mid 20th century, in America more broadly with Christianity, because American Christianity is very different than European Christianity. Once there was an idea that Jews were not the enemy to be converted, but maybe you still want to convert me, but we're not going to come at you with a knife. We're going to come at you with a book.
Yeah.
So he's referring to a switch that happened that, obviously, there was a time when Christians also felt similar to what I think Islam feels today, which is that we got to do this by force. And at a certain point, there was a switch, and that switch is recent. I mean, I remember growing up when there was much more hostility. I think today there's been, with the rebirth of Israel, I think there's been a lot more good faith between the religions. Is that your observation as well?
Okay, so that is one very big moral difference between Christianity and Judaism. So forced conversion is not loving your neighbor as you love yourself. That's not love. That's oppression. And it is true that in the history of Christianity, there has been a lot of oppression against both pagans and Jews to force them to convert to Christianity. That behavior in particular is a gigantic moral difference between Christianity and Judaism, and many Jews over the centuries have been made to suffer because of this difference, and also many pagans. Right?
Many Jews have died because they did not want to accept the Christian faith.
Right, that's right. Or they were expelled from various countries, or they were forcibly converted, even when the
Marranos, the people, around.
That's right. So that is a huge difference in the history of Christianity and the history of Judaism. Now, what is behind the perceived imperative on the Christian side that Jews must be converted? This goes back to fundamental discomfort that is felt by Christians, and it is natural that they feel it, because the basic claim that Christians are making is that the Jews were wrong to reject Jesus as Messiah. And it's uncomfortable because the authors of the books that contain the supposed prophecies that identify Jesus of Nazareth as the Jewish Messiah are the Jews. The Jews are the authors of those books where Christians claim to find the prophecies that identify Jesus of Nazareth as Messiah. So if the Jews are saying that Jesus wasn't the Messiah, and they're the authors and custodians of the literature where Jesus is supposedly identified as Messiah, well, that's uncomfortable. You don't want the people that is keeping those books to be denying your argument. Because they obviously have a historically grounded authority that then makes your claim kind of unsatisfyingly supported. So there has been a strong tendency in the history of Christianity to try to get the Jews to say, no, we were wrong. You're right. Christianity is right. We were wrong to reject Jesus. And if Jews did that, then Christians would be vindicated, and this insecurity that they feel before the rejection of the Jews would disappear, right? So long as the Jews exist and they continue to refuse Jesus as Messiah, the Christian insecurity cannot be erased.
Willing to come up with what are the significant differences, and so
Well,
I need a Christian to tell me what is the significant difference. I can argue with it.
My question,
because I know my own religion better than I know Christianity.
My question has been, I don't know if the role that the state plays in Judaism and Christianity is the same, because I'm not sure what to make of what I would say is the Jews put a tremendous amount of emphasis on the state as a mechanism for salvation, something like that. That might be the symbolic idea that underlies the establishment of Israel.
Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, Judaism is certainly a program of law more than anything else. And that law certainly includes the organization of the political system and of the state. Therefore, yes, Jewish law is concerned with the organization of the state, and it has a lot to say about that. So, for example, the separation of powers is an idea that you can find already in ancient Jewish law, right? The idea that the priest cannot be a political figure, right?
The king can't be the priest, and the priest we've
exactly.
seen it.
The priest can't be doing politics, and the king cannot be a priest, right? So that separates religious and political power, which is very important. You don't want those combined because oppression will certainly follow. And then you also have a separation of economic and religious power because the priests may not own land. The priests can only eat from the animals that are sacrificed at the temple that people bring in order to make offerings to the Lord and to expiate sins and so forth. But the priests cannot be capitalists who own land. That's forbidden. And that separates religious from economic power, which is very, very important. The law also has things to say about the relationship between different political statuses. So, for example, although there is a category of slave in Jewish law, these slaves are really more like protected workers, indentured servants, because they can't be slaves more than 6 years. They have to be liberated on the sabbatical year. When they are liberated, they have to be given a little something from the previous master so that they start their life in liberty. They cannot be mistreated while their period of servitude lasts.
Any abuse sets them free. Any type of
abuse sets them free, etc. So all of these things are included in the law of the escaped slaves. And naturally, it is a political system. Now, Christianity on the political side, we were talking earlier about what Christianity inherits on questions of ethics and morality from the Jews, right? So the basic principles of ethics Christianity gets from the Jews, but the principles of political organization are Greco-Roman. So the institution that established Christianity in the West is the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church takes its political model from Greece and Rome, and therefore there is a huge difference in terms of what kinds of state organization will be acceptable to Christians and to Jews. So for a long time, the Greco-Roman influence in the Greco-Roman theory of government caused that Christian societies governed by both the popes and the kings were quite oppressive, whereas that kind of oppression is completely unacceptable in a Jewish society. Now, it is true, however, that in the modern world, the Christian West has become more and more a Noahide civilization. I've made this argument. You've seen me make this argument in the previous video that you and I recorded, and in a video that I recently made about Noahide civilization. I claim that modern Western civilization is basically Noahide civilization, even though it is not technically so. It isn't technically so because Christians by definition, think that Jesus of Nazareth was the Jewish Messiah. And that's something that a true Noahide does not believe. So they're not technically Noahides, but they are basically Noahides because in the modern West, what Christians have done is institutionalize the basic principles of Jewish ethics in modern Western institution, in the modern Western system. So they may still be accepting Jesus of Nazareth as the Jewish Messiah, but the philosophy of government that they have adopted is operating under principles that are Jewish and no longer Greco-Roman, even though in Western schools, what they tell people is that we supposedly got democracy from the Greeks and the Romans and blah, blah, blah. That's really a pedagogical fraud. The Greeks and the Romans had systems of fascist totalitarian oppression. What we have in the modern West is democratic, plural, maximally participatory systems where everybody's human rights are guaranteed by our constitutions. That's something that comes out of Judeo-Christian ethical principles and out of Jewish law. It doesn't come out of the Greco-Roman tradition at all. So what has been happening over the last few centuries in the West is that revolutionary movements of Westerners, inspired by the book of Exodus, because in the Middle Ages, Christians began translating the Hebrew Bible, well, all of the Bible, all of the Christian Bible, into European languages that everybody could understand from the Latin, which nobody could understand. So in the Middle Ages, reading the Bible was basically forbidden because it could only be in Latin, and nobody spoke Latin except for a minority of priests. And so when the proto-Protestants, beginning with the Valdensians, began translating the Bible into European vernaculars, and people started reading the book of Exodus and understanding that the Jewish tradition is politically revolutionary, right? And that the Jewish God is on the side of the slaves and so forth, that inspired movements for political reform and revolution. And over several centuries, from the Middle Ages to the modern world, Christian communities managed to emancipate themselves politically and produce the modern democratic world. That is a process that can be described as the shedding of Greco-Roman political ideology and replacing it with a political ideology that in spirit is basically Jewish.
See, there's something beautiful about a Noahide, and I'll explain what this means. Is that
I agree.
It's something. It's beyond, like, anybody could convert, but a Noahide says, "I want to represent. I want to be on the people who are with the Jews, but are doing this as a Gentile," and that is so much more powerful. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Metaphor? Okay, so I really love this metaphor. A Noahide is like the kid in the playground who stands up for the oppressed nerd without himself being an oppressed nerd, right? So you see somebody's getting bullied and beat up, and you're like, I'm going to defend this guy. He deserves to be defended, even though you yourself were not getting attacked. You were not getting bullied. You were not a target of this kind of treatment, but you realize the value of this person, and you want to stand with this person and be a shield and a champion for this person. So the Noahides are Gentiles who want to play this role in the world. We want to be allies of the Jewish people. We want to join the Jews within Judaism because Noahides are included in Judaism, but we find 613 commandments to be kind of onerous. We don't want to do all that, but we do want to stand with the Jewish people. We don't find the entire behavior program that Judaism prescribes for Jews to be terribly attractive. It's not for us, but we do realize the enormous benefit that Judaism is for the world. We are convinced that God acts through the Jewish people for the good of the world. And so we want to contribute to protect that process in history. We want to be defenders of the Jews because we consider that the Jews are the treasure of this planet. And we are thankful for the Jewish people for the heroic role that they have played in human history and for the human rights and principles of justice and ethics that we have inherited from them.
And this is something uniquely Jewish, where you can stand and the whole that I think for Christianity and Islam, it would have to be that everybody becomes the same at a certain point. That, but I don't think Judaism says that. Judaism doesn't say that we all become Jews. What it says is that the whole world recognizes that there is a God who is a loving, caring God who has been directing the universe for perfection. But one thing that I'm concerned about, and this I'll ask you, is, if the Torah is just about morality, then where does Israel fill into the picture?
You mean the modern state of Israel?
Yeah, I mean Eretz Yisrael. I mean the entire redemption and the state of Israel or the ingathering. Why did we need a land? Why couldn't we just have God give us all the mitzvos and we go through?
There are two ways. I think there are two ways of answering that question. So one way of answering it is, why would you need to make a special argument, right? So I would throw it back. I would say, why do the Jews need to make a special argument that they should have their own state? I mean, we've been making the argument for a long time in the West, whether you agree with it or not, but we've been making the argument that it makes sense for cultural groups to be organized in their own particular nation states. That's a very sort of widespread accepted argument. It's the self-determination argument that has been dominant in world politics for a while now. It's a modern thing, but it's a widely accepted thing. So why does anybody expect that the Jews need to make a special justification? No, it's like they're like any other people. They have their own special culture. They should have their own special state. They should have their own nation state. So that's one way. That's one way to argue it. But if another argument is needed, then the history of the 20th century made an eloquent argument, because the countries of Europe did not protect their Jewish populations. They did not. Zero. They either collaborated with or did nothing when the murderers of Jews organized mass slaughter. So the experience of World War II confirmed the fears of the founders of the Zionist movement, in particular Theodor Herzl and Max Nordau. Do you know that Max Nordau predicted in 1911 that the power elites of Europe were getting ready to murder 6 million Jews? He said it like that in 1911. Max Nordau, right? So this idea that the Jews of Europe were very vulnerable because anti-Semitism was a constantly renewing ideology. It came back every century, and the Jews of Europe were in great danger, right? Confirmed in the mass slaughter of World War II. Well, if the countries of the world are not going to protect their Jewish populations, well, then the Jews absolutely must have their own country. And to oppose the notion that Jews should have their own country after the Holocaust, that turns you into an anti-Semite, because we know what happens when the Jews do not have their own nation state in which to protect themselves.
That's that you had mentioned this before, and I think it's still true today that the Jews are, I think with the exception of Chabad, I think the Jews are not working as much as we could, and it's definitely the time now to be able to use the position that the Jews are in now, where we have an army and we have a state and we have a religious group and we have secular group, and it's so important that we have the Bnei Noach and we have all these groups together, and each one of them has their special quality that they could approach different type of person. You know, if you were to convert to Judaism, you would have less say when you're speaking to a Christian because you're one of them. But now you can come to them and say, I'm one of you guys, and this is the way I see it. And I think that is something that we could, the Jews.
Well, I think I agree with you there. I mean, I think there's a special effect of speaking as a Gentile for the Jews. There's a special effect of that. So, yeah, you're an ally of the Jews, but you're still a Gentile. And when you make an argument in favor of the Jews as a Gentile, it is received differently. Maybe not completely differently if you are too closely identified with the Jews, as Noahides will be. But it is perceived differently than if a Jew makes that argument, right? And I think that has certain value because it causes some people to listen when they otherwise might not have.
Okay, so this is like a big one in religious Jews will always argue that morality in Judaism is not usually my conscience being my guide. And for instance, I can think of many examples. Incest, one marrying his sister, is that immoral? You know, now Western society would say, yes, it's immoral. But why is it immoral? Is it because their children will be defective? Or, I mean, what is immoral about that? They're in a committed relationship.
I think there it is important to distinguish morality from ethics. So ethics is more properly, in my opinion, is more properly described as the science of how you love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, how do you prevent harm to your neighbor? In Hillel's formulation, that which you hate, don't do it to your neighbor. You know, so it's that kind of thing. And Hillel said everything reduces to that. Okay, so and morality is rules about what is right and what is wrong, which may or may not be ethical. So your culture may say that it's wrong to grab the fork this way or that way. You know, it becomes a moral injunction, but it's not necessarily harming your neighbors to grab the fork this way or that way. It's just
well, mercy. Well, let's say a person, quality of life, death issues. Judaism has a lot to say on these things, which a lot of times are counterintuitive to Western society, and they need to go to court to try to uphold their moral understanding based on Torah values, which may not be what feels correct. Meaning the Torah is
But I want to get to incest, which was your question. So I think here the question is it possible to construct a reasonable argument that the prohibition against incest ought to be considered an ethical rather than a purely moral law? In other words, is it an arbitrary rule that has been valorized as good, which happens in every culture? All kinds of arbitrary rules are valorized as good, right? Cooking this thing versus cooking that thing, eating this thing versus eating that thing, that taboos of all kinds, that can all be arbitrary, but it is valorized as good or as bad, right? So it feels like it's participating of the same universe as ethical laws, but they in fact have little to do with causing harm, right? So the interesting question is, can you make a reasonable argument that the laws against incest ought to be considered within the universe of ethical laws? My attempt to defend an argument of that nature would go like this. It is unethical to hurt the structure of the family, because without a family, you cannot have a proper civilization, a proper society where individuals are properly protected. And incest is one of the things that hurts the structure of the family. Okay, so yes, I think the family should ethically be protected against
Beautiful.
incest.
Well said. I think the Torah says that as well. It says, "Kedoshim tiyu," you should be holy, and the laws of which are one of the 7 Noahide laws of as well of promiscuity involve the things that uphold the family, and that in itself is God-given. But one thing that is strangely enough is the dogma of Judaism. You know, we have a lot of dogma things that we do, which we shake a myrtle branch with a citron and a palm branch on Sukkot. We shake all these species of fruit. And that's supposed to do things. There's lots of dogma in Judaism, things that are done without reason, without it's just God said to do this, and we don't. It doesn't like I wear tzitzit, right? I wear these 4 strings. Now the Torah says that it's supposed to it's supposed to remind you. I just look at it as string. It's just my drip. This is the way I go. But
it doesn't remind you.
It's supposed to have a blue string, which mine doesn't have, and the blue string would remind. It's actually 4 strings over here, and they're double tied, and there's 7. There's a list of knots that are over here. It's supposed to remind us of God, that He created the world, that He gave us mitzvos, and we're supposed to see them and be reminded of God, and not to sin. So this is and the Talmud tells us that the blue string that is supposed to be here, the tcheles, is supposed to remind us of the sea. The sea reminds us of the heaven, and the heaven reminds us of God, and therefore we run away from sin. And there's a story of somebody who was going to sin, and he saw his tzitzis, and they slapped him in the face, and then he stopped sinning. So, but there's dogma in Judaism. There are things that we do that we don't understand. And those things that we do, what we don't understand, those are acts of faith. We're doing things that make no sense. One of the things that's very important is that Judaism really wants people to have a relationship with God, and when you're in a relationship with anybody, there's certain things that you got to do. You have to do certain things that keep the relationship. And sometimes we do things that we don't understand why we do them or why the other person wants us to do them, but we know that.
But I think that you have identified the reason for many of these things. So taking the tzitzit as an example, I think it's a reasonable. You made a reasonable argument. The tzitzit are there to remind you that you're a religious Jew, and that you shouldn't sin, and they're there to remind you all the time. They're hanging from your pants all the time. Right?
What about tefillin? Tefillin.
Huh?
It's tefillin that we wrap on our hands and we put on our head.
The tefillin is another example. These are things that remind you that you're a religious Jew, and in so reminding you, they have a functional effect. In other words, they function to help keep your behavior within the norms that God is asking that you keep. So I think it's not like they're not meaningless. Now, of course,
no, right.
we could find things for which the function is so obscure, or in fact, you might, for example, in the halacha that has been established about how to interpret the Sabbath laws in a modern electronic technological world and so forth. There, I think there can be reasonable disagreements about how those laws should be interpreted and applied, and disagreements have been that there are living controversies about those interpretations, and those debates should be had. And if a similar controversy could be started about the tzitzit, I think it would be acceptable to discuss it. But I don't think that a lot of these behaviors are easily interpreted as this is to, and the Talmud says this, that a lot of these things are there so that the child will ask, what is this about? And then because there's an interpretation of what the function of that symbolic tradition does, the fact that the child asks is an opportunity to explain it. And in the question and the explanation, there is a reinforcement of what it means to be a Jew. And in fact, I remember there's another Talmudic injunction that says you must ask the question and answer it even when you already know the answer. In other
Yeah,
words,
that's on the night of the Seder, the night of Passover. We want to be able to tell over the story, and it says that even if somebody is alone, he has to ask the questions to himself, and this is so important. But even when we talk about the reasons for mitzvos, our sages tell us that the reasons for the mitzvos are ways for us to be palatable, but ultimately, there is this inherent belief that there's certain things that the Torah is not all about things that make sense, because there's a danger in using and I think this is really where Christianity and Judaism divide, where Judaism says do things even if you don't understand them, and that's called a chok. The things that we don't understand, it's just the way it is. There's not an understanding for it, and God said to do this. And like the red heifer, we really don't understand why a red heifer. What is that all about?
I agree. There are things that fall in that category.
There are things that fall in that category, and the difference between, like, imagine a king or somebody tells somebody to do something, and he just figures that he wants the job to get done, but he doesn't understand that there's something else going on. There's a bigger picture, a spiritual picture that we're that we're not in touch with.
Okay, I would say something about that, which is that even when a commandment, even when the function of a commandment, the reason for being is obscure, there is no commandment to abandon the effort to give it an interpretation. And in fact, for the red heifer and for everything else, the rabbis try to provide an interpretation. And their efforts at providing an interpretation can often be opportunities to consider really profound things and useful teachings. So yes, the red heifer is mysterious, but the efforts at interpretation that various rabbis have given about the red heifer are interesting. And the way they try to derive it and make it consistent with the rest of Jewish thought, I think, is fascinating.
Yes, excuse me. It is fascinating, but I think the element of being subservient, even when we don't understand, is very, very important in Jewish law. Meaning that, take for instance the monetary laws in Judaism. Now, monetary laws in Judaism should be decided today by a Jewish court. In every community, there's several of them. There's a rabbi in a room, and it's usually a mediation process. And sometimes with larger amounts of money, people will get a rabbinic rabbi to be their kind of like lawyer. It's called a rabbinic lawyer, where he would he would look at rabbinic law or look at previous cases and try to
have a kind of an adversarial process. But the ultimate goal of the Jewish court system, which interestingly enough, it went through some transformation, even with Jethro coming in. Jethro started with creating different sections of courts, and it's interesting that this was the story that was given. Well, Jethro is the first one to follow the Noahide commandment, the seventh commandment of the Noahides.
Right? Yes.
He's the first one to do it.
And he shows up, and until today there's a entire community in Israel who believe that they are descendants from Jethro. But Jethro's the importance, the significance that the Torah tells us about Jethro was that Moses listened to him, not because he was his father-in-law, but because Moses saw something very intelligent and something. And if you look at Maimonides, before Maimonides, he was the first Jewish person. If you look at the Rif who came before him, when he wrote Jewish law, it was just like a newspaper. It was God forbid. It was just like a lot of things without organization. And then the Rambam comes along and he's the first one to categorize different sections, different volumes. He divides up the Talmud and the Jewish law into structure.
Rationalizes the Talmud.
Yes. And then, and from that becomes Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who makes it even more organized. And then and it goes through these stages where it's actually using a lot of ideas from non-Jews and from great thinkers of how to categorize and how to think and how to separate different things. So Judaism takes a lot of pride in that it is open. It
doesn't reject ideas from the Goyim.
It doesn't. Not only does it not reject, it wants these inputs, but the ultimate thing about the court case, going back to going to a beit din to get somebody owes somebody money, is that there is a spiritual aspect of it, meaning that if, for instance, if somebody has relatives who witnessed him borrowing money, they are not good witnesses. Where in a American court, we don't care if it's your brother or your mother being witnesses for something. Anybody could be a witness. There's no, I mean, obviously will be taken within reason, but I think in Jewish court there are certain rules that are in place which make it that the rabbi ultimately or the beit din can decide certain things, and we kind of like give over our decision to the court, and we say we will follow the court. And God very specifically writes this in many places.
Well, but that's common to all courts. The whole point of a court is that you as an individual agree to abide by the decision of a third party that will act as the impartial judge for any particular issue. Right?
But here's the difference. Here's the difference. The difference is let's say I know that I already paid this guy back the loan. I know I paid him back the loan and he signed the paper, and the court says you have to pay him. So I have to go now pay this guy, and I have to do it even though I know that I'm right.
That's true of all courts.
Right. But over here,
that's true of all courts.
But over here we say that this is the will of God. We don't say that this is just the will of man. We don't say that this is the court's decision. We say that it's God's decision, meaning that Elohim nitzav ba'adat kel. The verse says that God sits with the judges, and if the judges are seeking out God's will will speak through them, and sometimes it could even be that for some reason God wanted you to give this guy money. We don't understand it, meaning that Judaism believes besides for the logical, rational reasons behind the Jewish law, it also believes in something which is a spiritual nature of things, of God running the show, and meaning that we're subservient to things beyond logic. Judaism.
Okay, but would it be fair to say that this opinion that you have expressed about Judaism, or this claim you have just made about Judaism, would it be fair to say that there is no controversy about it?
There's always controversy about everything in Judaism, but I think for the most part, yes, I think that we would agree.
I find that one dangerous. I find that idea dangerous. So yes,
and it has been dangerous. It has been used dangerously, and there are preventative measures that these things don't happen. And as you said, we try to use the courts today as a way of getting the sides together to compromise.
Yeah, but you never want to say that what humans did has divine sanction, because when you do that, you're opening the door to oppression. Because the minute you say this decision is from God, the appeal process has been abolished.
Well, there's something interesting. In a Jewish court, if all the judges say he's guilty, he's not guilty. That's the law.
That's fantastic. I love that.
They say, because if everybody's saying guilty, then there's something wrong.
Wow, that's very
so meaning there is some logic to the madness that we say that there are and you know what, maybe the guy really is guilty, but God said that if everybody's saying guilty, then he must be innocent. So there is a lot to be learned about some of the illogic of Jewish law, meaning that it's not all making
no, but
sense.
that sounds logical to me, because what that is trying to shake out is corruption, right? Because if everybody is agreed, then it sounds like the guy never got a fair hearing, right? It's suspicious when there's no disagreement, because the evidence is always fragmentary. There's always different ways of looking at it, different points of view that you might take, and the Jewish tradition is hyper aware of the multiplicity of points of view on any issue. This is why the most famous Jewish joke is that you're going to have 3 opinions for every 2 Jews, right? So I think that's what that particular rule is getting at. Now, whether it achieves its intended function better than other rules we might imagine, that's a question. But I think the intention behind that rule is at least a wise intention, that we should be careful to examine possible corruption in the process that hands down judicial decisions.
Okay, so let me get back to the main. I think what I'm trying to give over is that there's a danger in allowing our conscience to be our guide. That is a very dangerous thing. Meaning, because what I would consider to be an alternative, getting somebody off of a breathing machine because he needs to have, it's not healthy it's not healthy. I mean, he's suffering, so allowing somebody to pull the plug on a breathing machine for somebody who's in pain, end of life decisions like that, or other ethical decisions. If we allow just whatever we feel to be correct, then we can go astray, because the sky's the limit. What do you feel? And every generation will have a different perception of what feels right, and every person has their own.
I think this question is worthy of an entire show. If
Yes,
you want to
yes,
bring me
yes.
back.
So,
I will only say this now. I will say this now, though. I think you're right that if you decide questions on the basis of what you feel, you will likely do a lot of harm. But I don't think doing things on the basis of your own conscience is the same thing as doing what you feel. I think that doing things on the basis of your own conscience is doing things on the basis of your own reasoning, your own ethical reasoning. Of course, your own ethical reasoning should be informed by God's commandments. It should be informed, but you cannot and should not, in my view, avoid reasoning for yourself. And I think the Torah makes that argument. And but I think this is for a separate conversation, and I'm more than happy to have this conversation with you at another opportunity.
Well, I think we covered a lot of topics. This is definitely a very interesting topic. I think we were around the world twice. Wow, thank you so much. Maybe you could lead us.
Thank you.
Maybe you could lead us out with a prayer or a message for our audience and we'll end with that.
Lord, please cast your eyes benevolently on the Jewish people. They're doing the best they can. They've always been doing the best they can. It is a very trying time for everybody in Israel. Don't abandon us, because the future of the history of this planet depends on the success of the Jewish people and on the defense of the Jewish people by Westerners everywhere. That will, if we succeed, we will bless the entire planet. And if we fail, the whole planet will fall into darkness. Therefore, please don't forget us at this juncture and help us grow the Noahide movement, so that we can have many, many more defenders of the Jewish people in this critical time. Amen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Francisco Gil-White. Thank you for joining us. If you want to see his channel, I'll leave a link in the description. Please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you very much. From just outside Jerusalem and from the shores of Ashkelon, shalom from Israel.